So today we will be looking at the third guidebook technique that I know. The uh, This one is also based on radio buttons to control which page you're on, but the HTML layout is much different, and um, that allows the styles to be, I hesitate to say simpler. It allows the styles to be once and done. Um, so if you add more tabs or um, if you add more tabs later on, you don't need to change your styles at all. And it also does not depend on having unique IDs or anything. So this is reasonably decent for putting in a skin where the people who are going to be updating the tabs have no um, no real uh, skill or understanding. They don't want to worry about somebody screwing things up with sort of the functional edits that the other ones have, where you can just copy paste the chunk. You can um, you could even put like the entire label and content in the same sort of embedded web page, and then if you wanted to add a new page, you just, excuse me, every time you want to add a new page, you literally just copy the old one, change the text. That's it. So in that sense, it's a little more foolproof on the updating side of the guidebook. Um, the sort of first technique that I covered is reasonably foolproof, um, but it does depend on you, uh, you know, putting in a unique ID each time that is cap sensitive and is um, a little bit finicky, even though there's only one thing that you have to uh, one value that you have to change and match in two places, which is simpler than the second technique where there's a couple values that you have to sort out in multiple places between the HTML and the styles and everything. Uh, but also because this is based on radio buttons, it can be used for a second layer of embedded tabs, or when you have multiple independent sort of groups of navigation or something. Uh, it's a little bit more limited in what styles you can put on it in some ways, but you have a little bit more freedom in some other ways. So it is quite good at sort of quirky layouts, um, although technically either of the other ones could be used for fairly quirky layouts. Technically, you could take the sort of section divs out of the other ones and just put everything in a grid the same way you kind of have to with this one. Um, and because you see with the layout, this one you don't have any choice over how the HTML is laid out, which limits you to using grid or very occasionally flexbox, but um, it sort of it lends itself. It feels more natural to use some of those quirky layouts. So it's good for uh, things like um, a tabbed user profile, or possibly a carousel header, something like that. Of course, the other two options could be used for that as well. Um, so of the three, this is my least favorite in some ways. Um, it it does have more limitations on the styling side. But if you want a style that this is capable of anyways, then um, it does make updating code and updating content, and in particular adding more pages later, adding more tabs later, easier for people who have a hard time wrapping their head around code. Um, so if, like I said, for um, things that are going to be distributed, or if you have staff people who are sort of nervous about touching code, um, the fact that the structure at least is straight copy paste, no updating styles, um, that sort of thing, it does make it fit into that particular niche really well. Um, so we will start with the HTML layout like before, and then move on to styling it. So, of course, as always, we've got our div ID guidebook wrapper. Um, to wrap everything up and isolate it from everything else. Now, unlike the other two times, we are not going to have separate areas in the code for the navigation and the content, um, which means, which is the reason why styling it ends up being a little bit less intuitive. Um, because eventually you want, all of the navigation to end up in the same place, like the same part of your page, right? So we are, um, unless you want an accordion style thing with, instead of tabs, you want like an accordion fac style kind of layout. Uh, but there's a much better way of doing that. So, um, yeah. But let's get into it. So for each page, we are going to have a label and a radio button. So input type equals radio. Oops. That should be quotes in the HTML. Okay. Label and input type equals radio. And then we are going to say that this is our rules tab, just like before. And then immediately after that page label button, we're going to put our content. So div class equals page content directly into this div, but I'm going to embed it as a separate web page. I've got a couple of web pages, sort of in existence, so uh, that'll fill this up with some sample content, but also without sort of the big paragraphs in the code, you guys can see what the actual functional part of the code is a little bit better. And then the other thing we need here is the name of the radio button group, which is just going to be Guidebook. So I have here let's give this a class. It'll just make it a little bit easier to style. Technically, neither class is necessary, actually, because we could use direct child selectors of Guidebook wrapper, because the tag type is different, right? We've got labels and divs, and we want all the labels to look the same, we want all the divs to look the same. But classes will make the styles a little bit easier to read. So let's throw them in. Guide navigation. Yeah, guide nav. So we've got a label for this page, which is going to be our navigation button. On the left, sort of for your classic guidebook layout, and then, or potentially across the top for if you're using it for embedded tabs or something like that. I will show you both sets of styles. And then we have our content page. And adding a second content page is as simple as we just copy paste that, and we change this to the new page's title, and we change this to the new page's content, if I can remember what things were called. If I want to put a external link in my navigation, then I can do that, same as we did for all of the other ones. They can all accommodate that. So let's see. Let's throw in the link to the members list again. And let's give this also the guide nav class. And then they'll end up mostly styled the same, but we can specify the tag name if we want to style the links separately than the page labels. And in this case, with the labels and the pages tightly bound together like this, the links go in between the pages in the same order that we want the labels to show up. So in that sense, it's the same. It goes in between the labels in the order that you want your pages to show up in your navigation. But it's just that each of the labels has the page immediately after it. Obviously, the link doesn't have an associated page. This one, and of course you can, if you want, just put the content of this page directly inside. We're going to say so whether you want to embed your page content or with some pages, or whether you want to enter it directly on into a single guidebook page, it's up to you. It's however you feel that sort of is an intuitive way of organizing things for you. Uh, well-organized code is very important for being able to come back and update things later, being able to come back and debug things later, but exactly what form that organization takes is, unless you're working in a group, in which case you all got to agree on the format. Um, but if you are working by yourself, use what makes sense and what you know you will remember in 6 months when you have to come back and debug it. Uh, yeah, so here's our HTML. And before we style it, here's what it looks like. We've got our um, selectable radio buttons um, with our clickable labels. Um, the member list and the page 3 label are running into each other here because we haven't told them to be block level elements yet. Uh, but this lets you visually see what the browser is going to be um, starting from when you start styling it. I think it's good to sort of understand what your HTML layout is before you start moving things around, especially when it's something like this, which is a little bit unusual. But let's throw some styles in. So some of these are very obvious and exactly the same as before. We want um, our guide nav. All of those elements, we want them to be display block. So even if we have uh, some running into each other, technically on this one, actually, that's not required because the way the HTML is laid out, we are forced to use either Flexbox or Grid because those will let us reorder the visual order of the elements on the page. And nothing else except absolute positioning lets you do that. And absolute positioning is the absolute best way to not understand why nothing looks right. um, absolute positioning is very good at things that should be absolutely positioned with relation to one other element. Um, if you want the little icon to always be sort of right in the corner, in the top right corner, but you know, not taking up a lot of space, other things can flow under it, like I have on my portfolio thread pages. Um, that's absolutely positioned, and that is what is meant to be absolutely positioned. If you are absolutely positioning every element on the page with as if the uh, sort of page itself was a giant canvas in Photoshop and you're just sticking things places, it will break on half of the people's browsers when they have different window sizes and different everything. That's just been my experience with my stuff and with helping other people with their stuff is as soon as Grid came onto the scene, absolute positioning was like my worst nightmare. Um, required for some things. If there's a better way to do things, there's a better way to do things. But regardless, the next thing we want to do is hide these radio buttons that are inside of our guide nav. So any input, you could specify here that you need type equals radio. Uh, there are no inputs in here that aren't radio buttons, and there never should be. So, being that specific is not really necessary. but it does make it really obvious what you're doing here. You're hiding the radio buttons, um, and sort of remembering that input means is a radio button as well as like text input and things. The it's not that it's hard to memorize this stuff, but it is sort of that one extra cognitive step. In the same way as we could say guidebook wrapper, immediate child label, the computer would understand that. We're going to say guide nav as a class because it makes it easier to read. Um, so technically optional, but definitely sort of makes everything obvious. It's almost like you're adding a comment, but regardless. Um, and then guide page is going to be uh, not displayed by defaults. Display none. Because obviously we only want one of them to be displayed at once. So we're going to say that the page associated with the currently checked radio button is going to be displayed. So let's go ahead and put a default one up. And then we can say that a guide nav that has a radio button. One moment. Sorry, I have a cough today. Mm. Okay, gotta chat. All right, no volume. Crap. Okay, let's see if we can fix that at all. Um, my audio mixer is telling me that I have. Okay, that's 9.5 decibels is there crossfade going on? Um, what the heckity heck? Yeah. Okay. That's um. I think I'm popping. Oh bother. Okay. Let's try turning it up even further. I'm gonna go ahead and conclude that my mic is just terrible. Okay, but I think I have. Okay, I think I have sound now. I will start this over. Um, I have, and now it's telling, but it is also telling me that I have a bit too much bit rate, which, yeah, that's just going to cause lag, which is a lot less important than if I was streaming video games, that's for sure. But I wonder if I can fix that too. I don't know if I can fix that mid stream or not. Okay, what is that gonna do? Oh boy. Um, okay, I will just go ahead and start this over completely. Also, closed captioning is definitely not working, which annoys me, but I don't think I can fix that right now. It's not my extension, and I have no idea what's going on there. However, still complaining about my bit rate. Can I change my screen resolution without actually changing my screen resolution? Encoder preset slow good quality. Medium. Maybe? I don't know. Hopefully that won't make the text blurry or anything. Would not be the first time that I have to start something over. Okay, so that's making the crap. Still saying unstable, and it's making the text slightly fuzzier. However, um, we're not doing game streaming, and if it skips a few frames here and there, I don't think that's a problem. So I'm not going to worry about that. I believe OBS is buffering it anyways, assuming I have any understanding of uh, what I'm actually doing over here, which is quite a strong assumption, actually. So, apologies. Is anyone still in the chat to tell me if... Okay, whatever you did helped a little bit. Yeah, I was able to hear myself at like half volume on the moderator thing. It is still quiet. I'm also not a loud person, I'll admit that. Okay, let me see if I move my mic a bit closer um, without popping it every time I breathe too heavy. Um, I'll turn it up a bit more. Whatever. I have to figure out the mic situation, but definitely wish that I could afford a better mic, but I can't. So, here we go. Maybe I'll put a donation goal up or something. Okay. It is at like 800% gain. So, I will try and talk a bit louder, and I'll try and talk a bit louder, and hopefully that will be okay. I will end up redoing a bunch of these eventually because I say too much is the first thing. All right, so let's go ahead and start over. Right. So we're going to do the third guidebook technique, which is a bit harder to wrap your head around when you're setting it up. I feel like it does require understanding grid flow, although I've already wrapped my head around it, so there will be copy-paste code up on my site eventually. It does have some limitations in terms of what kinds of styles that you can put in it. And I find that it works, it sort of lends itself better to really quirky layouts, like some kinds of tabbed main profiles and some kinds of like banner headers, the carousel banner headers, more than it does guidebook, just because I tend to prefer, for the main navigation, I prefer the first one that I showed, with the anchor links and using target to style which a page is visible. But this is another radio button layout, and so it can be used for like embedded tabs if you have more than one tab section on a page, like some profiles, but also if you have embedded tabs or embedded sections, you need sub navigation on your guidebook, whatever. you do need to start leaning on radio buttons at that point. Um, the sort of the only advantage that this one has over the previous one is that literally all of the complicated bits are setting it up. So in that sense, it's uh, quite good for skins that you're going to sort of share with people that have no um, conf- confidence in their ability to edit HTML code, or because I'm of the opinion that anybody can, especially if they're given good instructions, but it is very intimidating for some people. So uh, this layout, when you're adding new pages, you don't even need to worry about like unique IDs or anything like that. You don't need to update the styles. Um, and it's literally copy paste the page structure to add more pages. So if somebody with no technical skills or somebody who's intimidated by the idea of editing code even with instructions is going to be making updates, especially adding pages to a guidebook or something like that, um, or you've just gotten really frustrated with the fact that IDs are cap sensitive and everything's a bit, everything's finicky when you start getting into like needing to use IDs for everything and very specific, sort of fiddly bits with the code, and you're just done with that. This might be a solution. Um, but it's also, you know, um, it works. So we're going to start the way we always do with defining our sort of wrapper elements. So we have guidebook wrapper. And that's going to contain all of our, um, that's going to contain all of the tabs and pages and everything in our guidebook wrapper and allow us to isolate the guidebook styles, um, so that things don't, affect the rest of our site. So all guidebooks need somewhere to live, right? In this case, that guidebook wrapper is also going to be our grid container. Um, with the other ones, it was, just a way to constrain things, but in this case, that is actually going to be um, like we have to style that element, so we definitely can't get away without it. Um, and unlike the other ones, though, that's the extent of sort of our sectioning of code. We're not going to create separate divs to hold the navigation and the pages. We're just going to jump straight into this. So for each page, we need a label element. That's going to be our navigation. On the left-hand side for your classic guidebook layout, or across the top for your classic tabs styled layout. And we're going to use the implicit association between label and input radio button. So this is your actual radio button. We got input type equals radio. We might as well give it a class. Sorry, we're going to give the label a class. That makes it really easy to style later. We could just say the labels that are in the guidebook wrapper, we're going to style those a certain way. But giving it a class makes it a little bit easier to read the style code later. And that's always a good thing. So we've got our input type equals radio. Um, and the other thing that it needs is a name to make sure that all of these radio buttons are going to behave as a single group, right? You only want them to have one page selected or one tab in that tab group selected at a time. And while not interfering with any other tabs or radio button controlled elements on your page, whether they're sub-navigation in your guidebook or whether you have something else in your site header or somewhere else, tabbed sidebars, whatever the heck you have. We want to make sure that every tab group is behaving as a group. So that means putting a name on it. So it does need to be unique compared to any other things that you have on your site or on this page. Obviously, if you have something in your main profile, that cannot interfere with this, but it's not just limited to what's on this web page, what Jason calls a web page. But for that only has to be set once, because for all of the pages in your guidebook, it's going to be the same. So adding additional pages is not going to require any knowledge of the rules to generate these, like what makes a good class, what makes a good name, any of that stuff. Whoever's updating this does not need to know any of that. So we're gonna use the first page will be our rules, same as before. Close off this label tag. And then instead of continuing with the rest of our navigation, we're going to go straight into the page that is associated with that. We are not using IDs in this case to associate our radio buttons, our rules, our labels. So the controller, which is the radio button, the navigation labels, and the content page are not being associated with IDs. We're not using any of that. We are just using the code structure itself to organize what goes with what. So we'll give this a class of guide page. Again, we could just say divs that are a direct child of guidebook wrapper, but that just makes the style sheet harder to read, and there's no reason to do that. So let's see, one sec. Sorry, I've got a cough this week. I don't think I'm coming down with anything in particular. Hopefully I'm not. Oh. So div guide page, and I can just reuse the same embedded sample pages that I created for the previous demos. And that works great. And then, so now we've got our first label and our first page of content. And to add another page to our guidebook, we literally just copy paste that code. We're going to change this to claims. We're going to change this to embed the all claims tabbed page that I created. So it is literally change the label, change the content. If you have, somebody who's really worried about editing code, messing things up, how many things do I have to need? You could put all of this in the embedded style sheet, or sorry, in the embedded uh, pages, the so this with the claims content, because you can't nest pages more than one deep. Um, but you could include this wrapping code in the embedded page, and then literally to add a new page, it's a matter of copy an existing page, change the name of it, change the content, um, you know, and then add the wrapper key here. In order to embed a page, you do have to change on the child page. You have to change allow key use in board wrappers to yes. That setting gives permission to include the page in both board wrappers and in other web pages. It's the same setting. The parent page obviously doesn't need it. But so just like before, we can also throw just a link to another page in the guidebook navigation to help people sort of have one place to find everything, even though it's not technically a guidebook page. So we'll just go ahead and give that a guide nav class as well. And because that'll make it easy, if we give out styles, they'll apply to everything in that navigation column without having to sort of explicitly say that we want to style the labels and we want to style the links. But of course, we can style them differently if we want to have a little bit of indication to people that some of these are pages and some of these are links. We can identify them by the tag name, but for the sort of positioning and padding and everything that we want to be the same, we can just use the class this way. So let's just put in the link to the member list that we did before. And sort of, it might feel weird to put the sort of link in with the pages, but actually just like before, all we're doing is we're putting it in order with the other navigation elements, with our radio button labels that are identifying each page. In the navigation, we're putting the links in between those in the order that we want them in. It's just that this time the guide pages have moved to live with their labels. So actually that, in terms of styling it, it can take a little bit of wrapping your brain around how you get one into one column and one into the other column. Although once you understand it, it's fairly straightforward. Some of the styling syntax is a bit weird or a bit unfamiliar to a lot of people, but I will have copy-paste code up later, probably next week. I think last week I said this week, but I wasn't expecting to have these come out. I'm not going to finish the series until Wednesday at the earliest. But I may so hopefully I'll get the code up this week into the portfolio. But it might be next week. But it will come up. It will get put up there. So let's just throw in a third page here. Why not? So this one, I don't know what goes here. Page 3. And instead of, instead of using the embedded pages, you can always just put this in. So I don't know, div class equals main title. And page 3. And we'll throw a paragraph in here. Um, so, you got your page title, you got your content, which is basically what's in these sort of sample pages. It's just, more than one paragraph. But that's kind of it for the HTML layout. Obviously, what's in those pages can get as complicated or as simple as you want. But in terms of the functional HTML for this guidebook, this is it. We've got our labels. We've got our radio buttons inside the labels, so they are implicitly connected to each other. We don't need IDs. We don't need for in order to make these clicking on the label, like we can hide the input button because clicking on the label will select that associated, the actual radio button itself. And we're not going to need IDs or anything like that to associate the label with the pages, because we can use positioning here, because every single page is immediately following its label. So at this point, we have no styling on it, but it looks like this. So we've got the labels that are clickable. You can select them. Selecting them doesn't do anything at the moment. We haven't put those styles in yet. We've got a label for each of our pages. We've got the pages themselves. Our link is running into our third page label here, because we haven't told them to be block level elements yet. And by default, both of these elements are inline elements that they'll consider themselves to be part of the same paragraph unless you tell them otherwise, is what inline means. So you have sort of the two types of display. And then things like flexbox grid get complicated, but they're basically variations on elements are either sort of a part of a paragraph and part of text flow, or they are their own box on the page. Those are your two options. So let's throw some styles up here. So we need to hide our radio buttons. So that's just going to be guide nav, if I can spell it correctly, and then label. No, sorry, input. Display none. So this is all of the inputs inside of guide nav classes are going to be display none. So we're not affecting anything on the pages. If you happen to have an actual form that you want to look like a form on one of the pages in your guidebook, I know there's some codes floating around to be able to use that instead of having people post like staff requests to a specific thread. There's a form for it. So specifying that we only want to affect the inputs that are inside GuideNav rather than everything in the guidebook wrapper means that they won't affect anything like that if you happen to have it in your guidebook, and if you don't, it doesn't do any harm, right? So we also know that we don't have any other types of inputs. We've only got radio buttons. But we can say type equals radio anyways. And I always do this because it just makes the code sort of easier to read later. It's almost like putting in a comment that, this is what we're doing here is we're hiding the radio buttons. And memorizing that radio buttons are input tabs and input radio buttons are input elements, and input doesn't just mean text input. Like, that's not that hard to memorize, but every time you read that, there's like one extra bit of pulling something up from memory that you have to do, which means that it's just that little bit slower to read the code. And if you're already having frustration with the code, you want to make it as sort of easy on yourself as possible. So I always put them in. Again, if it makes it easier and it doesn't do any harm, do it, right? So that's our inputs. So our radio buttons are hidden. And our, we can go ahead and say guide nav is going to be display block, I guess. Again, apparently I can't type. But anyways, so we do want like each of our guide navigation elements to be their own thing, and not run into each other, not ever end up on the same line. Technically with this one, because the only ways to style it, to like sort of pull all the navigation elements together and all of the pages in the sort of main section and the navigation off to the side, whatever. The main way to do that is grid. Grid is the best way to put like the navigation off to the side to get that classic guidebook look. And Flexbox is the best way to get the tabs up to the top if you want sort of a tabbed look. And technically you could do it with absolute positioning. That's how we used to do it before grid was invented, or before grid was implemented, whichever way you want to look at it. But absolute positioning tends to be very fragile. It's not good at doing big layout things because the moment someone's on a different screen size, the moment you add an element, the moment you remove an element, and you need everything else to sort of flow, move into that space, it's a giant pain in the butt. It's going to break eventually. Nothing's going to quite line up right. It's just really frustrating. Absolute positioning is really good if you want something to be very precisely positioned with regards to sort of one other element. The little round avatars that I have sort of overlapping the corner of the page, or the corner of each post on the portfolio, that's absolute positioned. That's perfectly, legitimate. If you want something, if you want some kind of background that, or a hover thing that needs to sort of exactly fit on another element, and it's going to move around with that other element, and they're just you mating those two elements together, but not in a way that sort of naturally flows, then that's what absolute positioning is for. And it's great at that stuff. In terms of sort of page-wide layout, I would never recommend absolute positioning. Learn grid, it's great. So this is technically not needed, but um, it sort of makes sense that it would be needed, and it really doesn't hurt anything. So again, if it makes you not have to think as much in 6 months when you come back to edit this or debug this or whatever, you might as well throw it in. And if you get really frustrated with this and you're like, no, 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 I'm going to give everything an ID and I'm going to move all the labels to the top and we're just going to do it that way, you know, uh, you kind of want the guide nav elements to be blocks on their own merits at that point. So it's kind of future proofing against, if you just decide to start over at some point. But again, if you do that, you're going to have a bunch of work to do anyways with regards to your layout. So, maybe it doesn't matter. But, so we've got our labels. We've got our radio buttons. We've got, so radio buttons are hidden. We need to hide the guide pages until they're selected. So the default guide page is going to be display none. And then we need to have the then we need to handle the page that is selected. So actually, I'm going to go ahead and flag this first one as being our default page. So when you first go to the, when you first load the guidebook, you'll have a page selected already. So we're going to start with that first radio button checked on page load, and that's going to be our default page. So for that, we're going to say, let's start with styling the label, because the way the page styles actually, grow off of that instead of the other way around like some of the other things. So guide nav has input type equals radio. That happens to be checked. So has is really useful. That's how you select like a parent element. So this is our control. This is our controller for which page is selected. Is this radio button is checked? That means that the associated, that's going to tell us that that associated page is going to be selected. It has to be marked in the navigation and the page has to be displayed. So if the guide nav element has inside of it a checked radio button, then we're going to style that parent element. So the element that has a checked radio button is going to get styled. And we're just going to say font weight bold like before. You can get as fancy as you want, but we're just demonstrating where to put, how the functionality works. So I'll talk about fancier styling on Wednesday, but for now we just need to identify that it's checked, and this is how you do that. And then to get the guide page that's selected, we find the active navigation element, and we look for the guide page that is immediately after it. So we're going to take this selector, and then we use a plus sign to mean the very next sibling element. So the thing that is immediately following is what we're going to style. So this is going to be our guide page. and it's going to be display block. And um, for this doesn't even really need to have a class because we could just put div here. Um, but and because everything's hidden, we could put like literally all of the styles that we need to here, and just say they all apply to the page that's displayed. Um, but in terms of code organization and in terms of finding things later and understanding your code later, sort of putting this functional code that's got these really complicated selectors and everything, sort of all the functional code goes in one place, and then sort of all of the styling stuff goes somewhere else, which is especially important if you have multiple skins on your site. You want the controlling code to be, like the functional code to be on the guidebook itself. If you get a new skin, if you have a lot of skins and you don't have time to go through every single one of them, right as you launch your guidebook, it'll work. If you have, you let people use the JSync default skin for, people who need the high contrast or the a bigger font size or a standard font size or anything like that, you can just let them use the default skin. And if you put basically just this in the web page, then you don't need to edit the actual skins, which is why I use main title for the page headers. The Because main title is used by JSync on pages that we can't edit the HTML of, it's the header on your search page, the header on your user control panel page, the header on the login page, and everything, right? So I know that on every single skin, main title will be styled, and it will sort of fit with the rest of the skin with zero effort. And I can go through into that skin and make things a little bit fancier. And in fact, I happen to have some skins that, it's got a style, and the style fits with the theme of the skin, but if it's on the wrong color background, it doesn't look right. Sometimes I'll give the guidebook wrapper the post color style so that I know that it is, sort of a, matching the background or something if you have an image background and sort of only the components have a solid color to see the text over. You can give this class post color. Again, almost every skin has post color styled, because if you don't have the post color class, quick edit doesn't work. So some sites don't need quick edit. They've just decided they don't care about that. But certainly 90% of skins have the post color class in them. And it's risky to use some of the other classes. Whether people use the sort of grid borders, table borders class, or some of the other common classes, whether they actually style those is really dependent on the skin. And even post color might have no styles associated with it, or it might have height and width associated with it, and it's too small for your guidebook. So that's a uh, sort of as needed thing to add to it, but it can be a really quick way of getting the right background color so that you can actually read the default color of text or whatever. Um, but you may or may not need it. It may or may not work. I find using main title is great. Um, I put main title all over the custom stuff too, just so that everything on my website is consistent. But uh, really up to you how you want to style it. Other than colors and stuff should go with the skin, and functionality should go with the page because um, yeah, you don't want the guidebook to not work at all on a new skin, and you don't want completely wrong colors to show up on some skins because you know one of them's light mode and one of them's dark mode and whatever, and it gets messy, right? So in terms of functionality, though, right? Like I think we're done. Let's take a look. Um, did I save my changes though? All right. I have a typo. I put styles instead of style here. This is what happens when I code and talk at the same time. So we're going to save this and refresh this page. And now we have functional page, right? I can click rules, we'll see rules. I can click the word claims, we get the claims page. The problem is this is now behaving like an accordion and not like a guidebook with a navigation column. If you want accordion for some parts of your site, that's great. There's a better way to do that. Don't use this. There's a built-in, much better way of doing it. However, I mean, you could. I wouldn't. I really wouldn't. Um, Regardless. So we now very easily, or um, sort of very, very once and done, have the pages hooked up to their navigation buttons. None of this will need to be changed ever. It doesn't matter how many pages you have. And um, when you create a new page, you only need to change the content. So you don't need to understand how the different parts of the HTML work with each other in order to edit this at all. That's the one kind of strength of this. We'll get to the one exception later, which is the other reason that I prefer using this for sort of tabs rather than navigation of a guidebook specifically. But, you know, it works. You can do it. Really easy. Now we have to get all of our navigation out of the way, or maybe our pages out of the way of the navigation, however you want to think about it. So this is where block comes in, or grid comes in. So we're going to take our guidebook wrapper element and give it display grid. And by itself, that's not going to do anything because the default grid is a one column grid of auto width, which kind of looks exactly like a stack of block level elements. You can add, if if you just want a stack of block level elements, sometimes giving it a grid or flex box is still beneficial. You have a different way of controlling heights of things. Uh, you can use gap instead of margins, and then maybe needing to like remove the margin on the first or the last element or something so that it fits with the rest of the page. Sometimes it's useful. But we're going to sort of use grid more uh, the way it starts getting powerful. So we're going to have a 2-column grid. First column is navigation. Second column is the um, page itself. And so the first column we're going to say auto, and then the second column we're going to say 1FR. FR is a flex ratio, which basically means that after everything else is figured out, all of the FR columns share the rest of the space. So if you had 2 columns that were 1FR and 1FR, they'd always be equal width, and their exact width would be calculated after everything else. So after all your autos, your percentage, your pixel widths, whatever, FR sort of takes up the leftover space. And if you had 1FR and then a 2FR column, the 2FR column would always be twice the 1FR width. I recommend my stream on relative units, relative versus fixed units. I go into that a little bit more, and like some of the fun things that you can do with calc and some of the more complicated patterns that you can use with this. In this case, I'm using 1FR instead of auto because if for some reason one of our guidebook pages does not take up the full width of the remaining screen after we've got the navigation column, but if one of our grid pages has really narrow column, like either it's like a table that only has a couple columns in it, or it's just got like a couple of bulleted lists on it or something, and it doesn't have big paragraphs that need the full width of the available space, auto will shrink it. Or if you put like width 100% on guidebook wrapper, it'll extend the sort of balance how much the navigation needs versus how much the content needs, and sort of adjust them in terms of ratios with what their content needs. And you really don't want your navigation width changing on each page of your guidebook. So auto will sort of fit whatever the content needs. One moment. Oh, crap. Sorry. I muted myself for a split second there and then thought I'd unmuted and hadn't. Can. Is someone around to tell me what the last thing they heard was? All right. Um, I'll try and guess. So, for display grid, um, we're going to use that to generate our columns. And um, so fixed width is a little bit better than auto because the sort of volume of content in the guidebook page might overwhelm the amount of content in your navigation. And the browser will actually try and like almost equalize the column heights of those two things and then like squish your navigation down to one word width columns. Um, so putting in a fixed width solves that problem. The problem with fixed width is even using a dynamic unit, which will scale with the font size, which is great if people like scaling their websites up, their web pages up. Um, but it doesn't scale with the overall size of the somebody's screen, or so on a huge screen it might be too narrow. Like visually, it just looks weird. Um, on a really small screen, a 15M might actually be too big, and you'd rather have the navigation wrap at that point, just so that your content can actually have a long enough line width to be readable. Um, so there are some ways to sort of make that column width flexible, but not too flexible, which I go into along with my more detailed look into this FR unit in the stream I did on fixed versus relative units. But for sort of displaying the theory of how we're getting things to flow into the right order and into the right columns, this will do fine for today. I'll also touch on sort of best practices for finding the width of that column and what to watch out for when I do the Styling Your Guidebook stream on Wednesday, I believe is when it's planned for. So that's in a couple of days. We'll go over styling uh, considerations and a couple of examples of fancier CSS that you might not be familiar with, but are really good to have under your belt. So this gets our columns right, but it doesn't yet get the positioning right. Like, save my changes, refresh the page, and did I spell something wrong? I put display here. That's not right. Okay, grid, template columns. So this is going to be a grid template columns. The template is, it doesn't matter what the content is, it's going to establish the columns first and then sort of push the content into those columns. There's a way of putting, so this is the problem with that. There's also grid auto columns and grid auto rows, which are used to sort of say, you can put in as many rows as you want, and this is how tall they're going to be. But I'm not telling you how many. Just base that off the content, right? So that's the auto option. And the template option is, this is how many we've got. Don't care what the content is, make it work. If your content overflows that, then it'll start getting into auto stuff anyways. But usually that's okay. In this case, we're going to try and sort of constrain that. But so far, we've got a navigation column, we've got a content column. If I've got these are in the right columns. If I switch over to claims page, though, it's flowing, right? Rules, claims is the next element, it goes in the next cell. The content ends up in the wrong cell. We need to fix that. So the way we fix that is we tell each of these elements where to go. Like, we're gonna tell them, and they're gonna go where we tell them to. So the other problem, if you look here, is that this rules is, taking up an entire table cell because it's one item, and the page content is taking up an entire table cell because it's one item, and that means that the next item has to be down here in the second row. So we got to figure out how to make the rules extend past all of the navigation stuff rather than the navigation stuff being pushed down below the content. So guide nav is going to be in grid column 1. And guide page is going to be in grid column 2. And I did a stream on grid earlier as well. So when you're labeling your columns, or when you're assigning content to specific columns and rows, it can get a little tricky because of what the numbers actually mean. If I come up here to let's bring up our developer toolbar, I can actually go to the layout tab, and there's a grid here, and I can tell it to display, like to actually show the lines of the grid so that we can see what it's actually doing. And here you can really see that this rules is taking up one cell, the rules content is taking up one cell, and that's pushing everything down. You'll also notice that this is a 2-column thing, but we've got 1, 2, 3. The numbers refer to the lines, not the cells. But the default width is 1 cell, and the default height is 1 cell. So if you just tell it grid column 1, if you wanted to explicitly tell it how wide to be, you'd use a slash here, right? So this means start at line 1 and end at line 2. But that ends up being the default. And this sort of intuitively makes more sense, is it's going in the first column. And where it doesn't make sense is where you go, 1/2, it's in the first column. 1/3 it's in the first column and the second column. And I go into that sort of in detail in the stream on Flexbox and Grid. But we don't care about setting the different widths for different items in this case. Every item is going to take up 1 column. So that's easy. Um, what's less easy is uh, that this grid page we do not want it to take up one row, which is the default. We want it to take up all of the rows. We want it to take up all of the rows. So if you look here, the 1 here is also labeled -1 over here. Positive numbers count sort of the way you expect them to. First column, the 1, 2, 3 in sort of normal reading order for English. If you set the reading order to be the other reading order on your page, then like if you have an Arabic language page and you've set it up correctly for right to left reading, then it'll switch around. But I'm going to assume everybody's using English here. So you've got sort of, your 1, 2, 3 where you'd expect them to be. But you also have negative numbers, and the negative numbers count in reverse. So down here in our columns, we've got -1 over on the other side, -2 is in the middle, and the -3 is at the start. Negative numbers count the opposite direction. But they still refer to the lines. And if you tell it to start at -1, it'll go off the side and force it to create a new template. You will notice that here, though, -1 doesn't start at the bottom. It should, but it doesn't. And that's because the negative numbers will only apply to templated columns and rows. Anything that sort of the browser had to create on the fly because there was more content than fit in your table, in your grid, those don't have negative numbers assigned to them. So we could say, okay, well, the rules is going to take up 1, 2, 3 3 rows, and or 4 rows or 5 rows. We don't want to change it every time we've got more things. Technically, we tell it, hey, take up 50 rows, which is actually what we're going to do in a second. But, and then if you don't have any padding or anything on your rows, then, or if you don't have any grid gap, there can be padding on the elements because the sort of extra rows that you're talking about that don't exist, those will collapse into 0 pixels because they don't have any content, and you haven't specified a grid gap, so there's nothing in between them either. But let's take a look at, if I just do that, we have a different problem. Grid, row, we're going to start at 1, and we're going to end at, let's say, we want to be really generous. We don't want to update this later. We're going to say 50. So that works. Sometimes it doesn't. If you've got some other stuff going on, if you want this navigation to sort of get pushed down a little bit, then you have to put padding on the first one only, or we can do whatever. But depending on what styles you put on here, let's take a look here at this inspect again. Where'd my thing go? It spread out these 50 columns really evenly. you know, so I said a minute ago that they were going to collapse down into 0 pixels, but they haven't here because the auto-generated rows, because we haven't templated them, we just forced it to create them by saying that this rules thing, the content, sort of whichever page, the page content is going to be 50 rows long. And so it was just forced to create 50 rows. It doesn't count as a template. You can see -1 is still up here. Um, and the uh, sort of, it can be a little bit fussy to get things laid out the way you want to. If you want to move this rules down, then you have to, you can add some padding to the top of rules, and you don't even need to say rules. You can just say add some padding to the top of the first label. Um, you know, I find that I don't like this. If some of your pages are going to be a lot longer than this, and um, the sort of, if you divide it in 50, it's going to be the you know the if you divide a longer page into 50 even things, then the each row is going to be um, longer. So like if we only said 10, then that's going to, like, visually right now, dividing this page into 10 is going to be the same as dividing a page 5 times longer into 50, right? So if I do that, we're still okay. What do we got here? Let's show this again. I didn't change my... I need to save my changes every time. Otherwise, nothing works. So again, we've got this auto. It's actually working okay. If we have, like, on some skins, you might have some other... if you have put in defaults into some of your other divs, or that somehow end up applying to this grid, you can end up with, let me see if I can force it to show you. Grid, where am I going? Align items. What do we got here? I always forget what some of these are. So it's okay. So we can do it like that. I find, then, if you have more than 10 pages, you got to update this number. You can be very generous with that. You can say 50. It will work. Just in terms of having the page be readable. So the problem that Firefox doesn't want to show you right now is that sometimes I had this problem on my portfolio, which is why I'm surprised that this isn't having that problem. But like these rows at the top would just like stretch. So if you said, 5 columns, they'd do that, right? And if we say, 6 columns, it's decided to behave itself, right? Um, so either way, even the way that I'm about to show you, if you end up with uh, the same number of, if your number of pages reaches the number of pages that you expected to have, like you expected your maximum to be, once you reach that number of pages, your layouts can get a little wonky. And that's the same. Um, so I guess this is just honestly just a preference thing. Um, but the the number of columns and rows in a grid um, should be set on the grid. There are reasons to have it be auto generated rows. Um, if you want something to be evenly distributed like that, um, and uh, if there's a situation where you want things to be evenly distributed and you don't want like some extra columns pushing everything to the top, if you have like a photo gallery type page where like it could be 3 items, it could be 200 items, like you start designing Pinterest board kind of thing, there's no point guessing. You just figure out what kind of rules for your auto-generated rows you're going to have and let the browser take care of the math. But in this case, it's sort of like I know what I want, right? I want this first rules item to get pushed down by a certain amount. I want the extra white space, whatever there is in that column, to take up everything so that all of the things with content get pushed to the top. Like I have that very specific layout in mind, and I don't want any kind of weird browser defaults. If somebody's using not one of the big browsers and that browser's implemented something funny, I want to be as explicit as possible, just because I don't like debugging weird things. And if I get it really explicitly set the first time, then uh, it's just easier for me to wrap my head around it. It's also um, that if I think, okay, I'm never going to have more than 20 guidebook pages, and I do, and so I have to come back and sort of edit this, because the thing that happens if you exceed this number, like if whatever you expect your maximum to be, if you end up with more pages than that, then you end up with stuff down here. This is a really weird example because I've only got 4 pages at all, but so you'd never assume that you were only going to have 2 pages, but if you did for whatever reason, you'll end up with stuff down below the bottom of your page again, right? And so sort of if I say I want my guide page to take up 50 columns, I'm probably not going to have that many pages. If I say I want my guidebook to take up 20 columns and then I end up with 21 pages, or 21 labels because I've thrown in so many links to like other resources on my site, right? Because it's not actually the number of pages, it's the number of navigation elements. Then like, and your rules page is 20 miles long. Then you're like, hey, that last item, why is it not anywhere? It's vanished. I'm really confused. Even if you figure out that it's at the bottom, then you have to remember that you have like, if you're like, okay, I need more space for the navigation elements, are you going to think to go look at the guide page definition? Probably not. You're either going to look at the guide navigation, but you want more space for your guidebook navigation. And so the amount of space that there is defined by the size of the guidebook wrapper, right? That's where you kind of expect it to be. So what I usually do is grid template rows, repeat, because I don't want to type out auto 50 times, repeat 50 auto, and then 1FR. And that says, I'm going to have 50 rows. I haven't specified a height for them. I haven't specified a grid gap. If I want space between the elements, I'm going to put in some padding, just so that these extra rows collapse properly. And then at the very bottom, I'm going to have a sort of bonus row that takes up all the white space below the navigation. So all of this space down here is that one massive bottom row, possibly with like a couple of pixels per row depending on for each space or row depending on the browser implementation. Firefox on, yeah, okay, this is weird. Firefox on Windows and Firefox on Mac don't behave the same way. So, that I don't know what's going on here. One of them is not following the standard, clearly. So so this browser has decided that there's a minimum height that it'll collapse to, or something, because this bottom row should be like seriously forcing everything up, and it's not. It does on Firefox for Mac. So getting your styles a little bit weird. Either way, everything below the navigation is sucking up all the space in the navigation, which is what we want. So now that we have these templated, our -1 column line, our -1 row line is down at the bottom where we expect it to be. And so we can say we're going to end this at -1. So this way, if for some absurd reason we end up with more than 50, the place that we have to update the number of slots that we have to put navigation items into is going to be in the container. And it just makes more logical sense for the amount of space available to be defined by the container and not by some other element that's not the element, that's not even the element that you're trying to make more space for. It's off, in another part of the page, and you have to update that one with the number of rows. You're going to be tempted to update it with a height, and that is completely wrong. Potentially, you'll be tempted to do that. Who knows? But again, in terms of organizing code so that it logically makes sense, this is how I do it. And Firefox on Mac behaves logically. I don't know why this browser doesn't. Obviously, one of them is wrong. I don't know which one, to be honest. Reading the specs for HTML is an exercise in breaking your brain. Um, Useful, but difficult. But for um, sort of for practical reasons, especially if the number of rows that you're telling it to expect is ridiculous. Um, let's just be ridiculous here. Let's go 500 because you're never going to run out of space that way. Um, okay, I think I didn't save my changes properly last time. Either that or this browser is just being weird. Hang on a sec. Right. So I don't think it was the browser. I think I didn't save my changes. So let's try this again. So if I put it up here, then that 1FR pushes everything up to the top and really forces it up there. So even if I have a ridiculously long page and that number of rows could, fit in there with space to spare, that bottom row will take up all of that space to spare. And then up at the top, we're going to be like guide nav, first child. Padding top, 2M. So again, I'm relating it to the font size because I don't care to figure out how many pixels that is. But just looking at this text, I can be like, okay, this bar that I want to push my stuff below is looks like it's about twice as tall as the text. So I'm going to try 2M. We'll see where that takes us. Maybe I want it and then I look at it and I'm like, a little bit more. Let's see. Right. Without the lines, that looks reasonable. I'll actually often put sort of title at the top that takes up that extra space. We'll go over that on Wednesday. But that's how to do this guidebook functionality. Any questions? Questions can also go into the Discord if you think of them later, and I will try and answer those on Wednesday as well. I will sort of go into some of the weirder layouts that you can do as well. Transitions, page transitions, like animated transitions, so that pages slide in instead of just, or fade into each other instead of just jumping around. I guess the last part of this, in terms of doing a guidebook layout, is you often want to link directly to a specific page in the guidebook. Um, and that with radio buttons requires JavaScript. And the JavaScript needs to be able to figure out which page you're linking to, obviously. Uh, so there's sort of two ways to do it with this layout. Um, One is to go ahead and put IDs on all of your radio buttons and use the exact same JavaScript as we showed last time, um, where the JavaScript will grab the right radio button based off the radio button ID, and then um, click that button on page load for you, basically. Um, the other way to do it would be, instead of putting in the name of a page, you literally put in the number of the page, and it goes, it figures out, okay, if you put that you want page 2, it grabs the second button. If you say that you want page 3, it grabs the third button, and it doesn't check it doesn't actually double check that there's any kind of matching. It's purely, like, literally page 1, page 2, page 3 from the navigation. Um, the, that I don't recommend. Technically, that works with the other radio button set too, right? Like, you can figure out, if you say page 1, it goes to the first page. If you say page 2, it goes to the second page. The problem with doing it that way is if you ever come back and rearrange your pages, right? Like, if you have 5 pages, and that's great, and then you get some more lore, you know, you get, you have, or you have 10 or 12 pages, a bunch of them are lore, you got a page per species, and you get an extra species because somebody talked you into making a new species for your game. You got to slot that in with the extra species. The claims were below that, and then suddenly all your links to the claims page said page 5, but the claims is now the 6th page. So all of your links that are supposed to go to your claims page are now going to your vampires page or something weird, right? You don't want to have to go through and update the rest of your site. But on the other hand, like, we said that, like, one of the only strengths of this layout compared to the other one was you didn't have to worry about your IDs, right? You didn't have to worry about update it, like remembering to change the ID once you'd copied the page structure from a different page, and any of that. So if you then go in and put IDs in, you're sort of diluting that. This one, you still don't have to update the styles, which is great, I guess. And so, there is still some benefit. But again, that's just why I feel like this is sort of more suitable to things where you don't need to link to a specific page or a specific tab. Header, carousels, every page load, you want it to come up to the main, the sort of main logo and stuff for your site. Main profiles, you sort of want to come to that general information tab every single time you load the page. You're never going to link to a different tab. You're never going to try and link directly to a different tab. Anything like that, right? So let's take a look at using this for, like, some kind of tabbed layout. Obviously, for main profiles, the tab links are often along the side or along the bottom. But, one side or the other side, along the bottom, whatever. If you want to put them on the other side, it's exactly the same as this. you just reverse the order of these and uh, reverse which grid column, right? Like navigation goes into the first column, the page goes into the navigation, you know, if you want it on the other side, it goes into that's the second column now, and right, so you just switch those around, but it's the same idea. Um, and then similarly with uh, the tabs, I'm only going to show you the top, but to get them on the bottom, you just reverse which. We're going to tell one of them to be at the top and one of them to be at the bottom, and you just reverse that to get them in the other order, right? So for tabs across the top, you could kind of like, the first instinct might be to just take this and rotate it, and say we're going to have like a bunch of columns and only 2 rows, and we'll tell it which row to be in instead of which column to be in. The problem is you can't wrap at this point. Like when your screen gets small enough that, or your number of tabs gets large enough that you can't sort of put that many words in a row without them running into each other. So instead, we're going to use Flexbox. So display flex, and then, oh, sorry, not the guide nav. Actually, one of the styles that I'll show next time, you know, we pointed out that we don't even need that. I'm not going to try and spell anything. Honestly, the fact that I can't even spell block at this point, this stream's gone on a little bit long. But so our guidebook wrapper, we're going to say flex, and template columns, template rows, we don't have that anymore. We're going to say display flex wrap. So, you know, even if you only have 3 tabs, you do still need the entire thing to wrap, because you need the page content to wrap below the tabs, right? So guide nav, we're actually not going to set anything there. Actually, that's not true. I'm going to set some padding. Actually, no, I'm not. This one, because we don't need to set a template, actually, we can just say wrap it as much as you want. We don't care. Do everything auto. Because the Flexbox wrap will never try and squish anything too small. And it will only try and stretch things out to fit, like to sort of scatter them across the column or across the full width in, if you tell it to. FlexWrap left aligns stuff by default. That's the standard. But if tabs, you know, actually look fine when you've evenly spaced them across the entire width of the screen, unless you have like 2 and a really wide screen. Sometimes it looks weird, but it really depends on your styles, right? If you've styled them, they might look fine like that. But, and then the height is always going to be, you know, 1 line height, because with the wrap, there's no pressure to shrink. It will just wrap it onto the next line. So we don't need to like start explicitly setting sizes because we're letting everything be its own size and flowing properly. The thing that we do have to do, though, is tell the page to be at the bottom because, according to the HTML, they're all mixed up. And we also have to tell the page to be at the bottom, even if there's only a couple tabs and there's very little content. We still don't want it to like come up into that first row, even if it could potentially fit. So we're going to go down to the guide page. Obviously, we're not setting any grid properties because we're not in a grid anymore. But we're just going to tell this that it's going to take up 100% width. Now, normally with 100% width, you'd have to take into account if guide page had padding or margin or whatever, and either use calc to sort of subtract that margin from the 100% or change the box sizing to border box so that the 100% tell the browser to treat the 100% as including the padding. But with a flex box, as much as I said it won't shrink anything, it'll just wrap it. If there's literally no more room in the row, it'll shrink it. You have to be pretty explicit with Flexbox to make it not shrink things that would go off the side of the page. Unlike Grid, which will do that happily. It'll put things off to the side of the page, no questions asked. So guide page is going to be full width, and things are going to wrap to fit. So that's great. We got that. But we want that content to be below all of the tabs. So the other thing that we're going to give it is an order, and it could just be order 1. The default order is 0, and multiple elements can stay the same order. It's like Z-index. If they have the same number, then they'll go in HTML order, and if they have a different number, then they'll go in the order that you specified. So guide nav by default is 0 because we haven't told it what to be. So all of the guide nav elements will flow sort of in whatever order they are in the HTML. And then guide page is order 1, so it will push itself after all of the order 0 items. And then finally we have this. I didn't take the padding off the top of the rules. That's why that was weird. We got all our tabs at the top. We got the rules underneath it. We do need to like put in some spacing. You can either put padding on the guide nav, or we can put a gap here. The good thing about putting a gap as opposed to padding on the guide nav. So I said on grid it's better to put padding on the navigation elements because then it's not affecting any of those empty cells. The empty cells can collapse completely as they need to, and they're not being forced to do anything. If you put a gap in, then that gap will go between even the empty cells. But this one, there are no empty cells, right? It's got, everything's auto. Flexbox uh, does not create extra um, cells. It is uh, not a fixed structure by nature. It just figures out how to arrange and stretch and shrink your content so that it fits wherever you tell it to fit into. But there's no creating sort of placeholder areas on the page. It just doesn't do that. So uh, 1M is uh, sort of the um, 1M is technically the width of the letter M in that font, which is a weird way of measuring font size, and it has to do with uh, print, like old letterpress print, where you had little stamps with each metal stamps with each letter, and then you inked them and pushed the paper, like before computers were invented and before printers were invented, and you had movable type printing, and they had all sorts of weird things to do with figuring out the size of the letters, right? Um, and figuring out column widths and row heights and everything that was proportional to whatever size letter they were printing in. They didn't have um, they weren't measuring things in inches other than like how wide their paper was. Maybe they certainly weren't measuring things in pixels. Pixels hadn't been invented yet. Uh, they had little spacer blocks that were the same size as a letter. They just didn't have a letter stamp on them. So, but this is really useful because once you figure out sort of this many M's looks good as padding and this many M's looks good as uh, vertical margin versus line height versus and you sort of go, okay, 2M's looks good for separating things that are supposed to be separate. 1M looks good for separating things that you really need them to not run into each other. And you don't want rules and claims to look like they're the same. Like if you click on one, it'll like apply to both of them. They're definitely separate items. They need to look like separate items, but at the same time, you want them to look like they're associated with each other. 1M's really good for that. And sort of once you learn all of those things, then that applies to any font. Like it doesn't matter. Um, if I have a 12-point font, 2M margin looks great. If I have a 24-point header font, 2M margin looks great. At that point, it might get a little ridiculous having 2M's. But, just for screen real estate size, but it looks proportional. Um, so, you don't have to start like thinking about math or like trying to, guessing and then adjusting numbers until it looks good. You're much more likely to get sort of it right on the first try, regardless of what font, regardless of what size, regardless of what skin, once you learn some of these sort of rules of thumbs with sizes. And again, there are some other sizes to do things that are proportional, either to the font size or to the screen size. That's in my stream on fixed versus proportional units. But yeah, so flex wrap to allow the content page to drop onto a second row, and then force the page content to be full width and after all of the tabs. Um, if you want the tabs to be on the bottom for like a header carousel maybe, um, you can either say, you can even move this and say, well, guide nav's going to be order 1, and that'll force all of the navigation elements to go below the guide page. Or you can say guide page is going to be order -1, and that will move it further up the page. So exactly like Z-index, it can you can make positive. You can put in positive numbers, negative numbers, integers only. There's no such thing as order 1.5, but it's just arranged in order, regardless of what you do. If you're not sure whether you want to put in something else in the middle of whatever, you can say one of them's order 0, one of them's order 5. Doesn't matter. It's just sort of sorts them and then puts them on the page wherever. No extra, you're not accidentally generating extra items or anything because it's Flexbox. You can also do that with Grid. Grid accepts order as well, and it will sort of reorder things before it puts them, before it lays them out with the whichever grid flow direction you've asked it to. I did a whole thing on Grid and Flexbox. So check out that stream, and I will likely be using some of those techniques on Wednesday. But if you're really unfamiliar with Grid and Flexbox, or you're really unfamiliar with relative size units, I would recommend that you watch those 2 streams first if you have the time. But I will try and explain what I'm doing as I do it too. So try to make it self-contained. But that's the thing. The other thing for Guidebooks, all of these, for these claims, these scripts, you shouldn't run more than one of these on page load. And if none of them are visible on page load, you shouldn't run any of them. There's some instructions on my portfolio, I think, about how to sort of manage that so that you don't overwhelm JSync server with too many requests at once. But I might cover that too. We'll see how much time we have on Wednesday, or we might push that off to something else. But I will cover it at some point. And yeah, we'll see how fast we go through things on Wednesday. At this point, though, I've been sitting in this chair for a little bit too long. So we're going to call it here for today. And this code will be up on the portfolio site sometime as soon as I can sort it out. I want to make sure that there are instructions along with it, which is why it's going to take me at least a few days to get it up. But yeah, hope you had fun learning today, and I hope to see you next time. So go forth and code, and I'll see you soon.